The moment I realized the world I thought I knew had quietly shattered, it hit me like an ice-cold wave. We were at his parents' anniversary dinner, 25 familiar faces around a polished oak table, the soft clinking of cutlery mixing with polite laughter, and suddenly I felt like a stranger in my own life. My fiancé, Garrett, smiling cruelly, announced to everyone, "She's just a little girl who needs her mommy." I froze. The fork in my hand trembled, halfway to my mouth. My chest tightened. My mind raced. Every Sunday, spent driving to my mother's house, every hour helping her with groceries, repairs, doctor appointments, everything I had thought was normal, responsible, loving, was suddenly ridiculed in front of his entire family. My mother, who raised me alone after Dad died when I was 16, had never asked for praise. She only asked that I be there, and here I was, humiliated for loving her. Garrett's laugh was sharp, deliberate, slicing through the room like a knife. Not the gentle kind of laugh that masks embarrassment, but that mean-spirited, stomach-dropping laugh that leaves you exposed and raw. She even left our date night early last week, he continued, eyes glinting, because her mommy needed help moving a couch. A couch, and all the money she wastes on her. The murmurs around the table faded into a dull hum as I tried to ground myself, breath steadying, heart pounding. I wanted to shrink into the chair, vanish beneath the tablecloth, let the room forget me. But the words kept coming, each one a nail in the coffin of the life I thought we were building. Garrett described, with casual venom, how he would control me once we were married, how my devotion to my mother was a flaw, a weakness, a childish dependency that deserved to be corrected publicly. I looked across the table at his parents, expecting some intervention, a glimmer of understanding, but their faces were a mixture of discomfort and polite avoidance. My stomach sank further. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a trial by fire. Every family member's eyes flicked between us, silently judging, measuring. And in that moment, I realized something irreversible. The man I loved, my fiancé, my supposed partner, was willing to destroy me publicly, to assert dominance over my life, my choices, and my love for my family. The fork finally clattered to the plate. My voice, quiet but unwavering, broke the suffocating silence. "You're right. Little girls shouldn't get married." I stood. I left the table. I left the room. And for the first time, I left a life that had only ever humiliated me, even before the words were spoken. I still remember the first time I met Garrett. It was at a mutual friend's small housewarming party, the kind where the living room is crowded, music faint in the background, and everyone is trying not to spill wine on the new carpet. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, holding a glass of something amber, laughing at a joke I couldn't hear. There was something in the way his eyes lit up when he smiled, warm, unguarded, that pulled me in immediately. I approached cautiously, not wanting to seem desperate or overeager, but he noticed me anyway. "Hi," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of voice that makes you feel seen without demanding anything. "I'm Garrett." And that was it. Just a name, a handshake, a spark I didn't understand yet. But by the end of that night, I felt like I'd known him for years. We shared stories about childhood embarrassments, failed cooking attempts, and awkward first jobs. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was easy. For someone like me, who had spent years juggling responsibilities, caring for my mother, and keeping my life in order, it felt like sunlight after a long winter. Garrett and I fell into a rhythm quickly. Sunday lunches with my mom became a shared tradition. He didn't judge me for it at first. In fact, he sometimes offered to help with small chores or to drive me home if I'd had a long day. I loved that about him. It was like having a partner who understood that love isn't just romance. It's presence, care, and commitment in the everyday. For 3 years, we built a life together that I thought was solid. We talked about the future, shared dreams about a home of our own, late-night conversations about careers, vacations we wanted to take, even how we'd decorate the living room. I supported him quietly in ways I didn't even think about, helping him navigate stressful work deadlines, lending an ear after family conflicts, encouraging him when he doubted himself. And he, in return, made me laugh, made me feel cherished, made me believe that what we had was unshakable. But alongside all the happiness, There were small, almost invisible cracks, little comments about my independence, my family, even about how much I earned. Nothing huge, nothing that made me question him entirely, but enough to plant a tiny seed of unease. I brushed it off, telling myself that love meant compromise, that people were allowed to have quirks, that he loved me in his own flawed way. I wanted to believe in us. I needed to believe in us. When I look back now, I can see the patterns forming, the way those small cracks widened over time, how they foreshadowed the moment he called me a little girl who needs her mommy in front of everyone. But at the time, all I saw was Garrett, the man I had laughed with, loved, and trusted, and I thought we were unbreakable. And yet, even in those early, tender days, I had a deep-rooted sense of responsibility, an instinct nurtured by my mother, to protect myself, to value my own worth. I never doubted that love could be strong, but I also knew that love without respect could destroy everything you held dear. That knowledge, buried deep, would later guide me through the storm that dinner unleashed. At first, the cracks were subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying close attention. Garrett would make passing comments about my mother, innocuous on the surface, but laced with a sharp edge that stung more than he realized. "Do you really need to see her every Sunday?" he had asked casually, as if questioning my love for her was normal conversation. "Can't she hire someone to fix her fence?" I laughed it off, brushing my hand across my forehead, forcing a smile. "She likes doing things herself," I would reply. But inside, a small knot tightened. It wasn't anger yet, not really. It was unease, the kind that whispers warnings you can't ignore. I reminded myself he'd been under stress at work, that maybe he just didn't understand our dynamic. Then there were the looks he would give when I mentioned errands or chores with my mom, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of impatience in his eyes, like he resented the time I spent outside of us. And sometimes the way he laughed at jokes about my dependence on my family, it wasn't playful. It carried judgment, a subtle assertion of dominance I wasn't ready to confront. The first real warning sign came during a weekend dinner at his apartment. His sister Melissa was visiting, and the conversation turned to family traditions. I mentioned that I had spent Saturday helping my mom reorganize her basement, small talk meant to be casual. Garrett's smile froze. He leaned back, arms crossed, and said, with a tinge of condescension, "Really? A grown woman spending her weekend doing that?" The words felt small, almost silly, but they hit me like cold rain. I felt a surge of defensiveness, the kind that makes your fingers curl around a fork a little too tightly, the breath catch in your throat. Then came the comments about money. Subtle at first. "Are you sure you need to buy that?" But gradually growing bolder, sharper. Questions about how I spent on groceries, gifts, even small things for my mom. I had always been independent, careful with finances, but he began to frame my spending as indulgent, childish, reckless. The tension built like a faint storm on the horizon, one I could see, but thought I could weather. And finally, the isolating comments. He would joke, or claim to joke, about how much time I spent with my family, how I couldn't possibly prioritize him over them, how some women had to learn boundaries. Each time my stomach sank, my heart beat faster, a quiet dread settling into my chest. I told myself he didn't mean it. I told myself I was overreacting, but the seed was planted. It was the small things piling up, subtle digs, patronizing laughs, passive-aggressive comments, that created a tension I couldn't ignore. I could see it now. The person I loved and trusted was starting to measure and judge my love, my loyalty, even my very identity. Each Sunday I spent with my mom, each errand, each act of care, became a quiet battlefield, a test I hadn't signed up for. By the time the anniversary dinner arrived, the storm had quietly gathered. Garrett's previous remarks, once brushed aside, now loomed large in my mind. The subtle power plays, the belittling comments, the judgment veiled as concern, all of it had been a prelude. I had no idea how completely it would explode, but the tension was unmistakable. I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me, a silent countdown to the night that would change everything. The night of his parents' anniversary dinner started like any other formal gathering, polished, polite, carefully curated. The dining room was lit softly, glasses sparkling under the chandelier, the aroma of roasted chicken and fresh herbs filling the air. I had spent hours preparing, choosing a dress that was elegant but not flashy, brushing my hair until it caught the light just right. I wanted to be graceful, to fit seamlessly into this world I had been part of for years. But as soon as we sat down, I sensed a shift. Garrett was unusually quiet, a tight smile on his lips. I tried to ignore it, focusing on his parents, on the laughter of cousins and uncles, the warmth of the gathering. I smiled, made small talk, poured wine, passed the bread. But the tension in Garrett's eyes never left. Then came the first crack. Bradley, Rachel's cousin, began boasting about his promotion, his new Tesla, his upcoming trip to Bali. The family laughed and congratulated him, and I felt a moment of relief, light, easy conversation. Until, that is, his aunt turned to Garrett. "So what about you?" she asked warmly, expecting a polite update. I opened my mouth to speak, but Garrett didn't wait. He smiled, that sharp, deliberate smile, the one that always made me feel off balance. Then came the words that shattered everything. "Oh, she works with computers," he began, but before I could respond, he laughed. Not a gentle, nervous laugh, but a cold, cutting sound. "She's just a little girl who needs her mommy. Runs to her every Sunday like clockwork. Can't make a decision without calling her first. I'm basically marrying a child." The room went silent. The laughter died in throats, forks frozen midair. My chest tightened, my hands shook. The polite murmur of the gathering faded into a suffocating stillness. Every eye was on me, measuring, judging. My face burned, heat rushing from my stomach to my cheeks, my throat tightening as if I had swallowed ice. Garrett continued, unrelenting. "Last week, she even left our date night early because her mommy needed help moving a couch. A couch! And don't get me started on how much money she wastes on her. New refrigerator here, car repairs there. I've told her when we're married, that stops. I'm not competing with her mother for the rest of my life." I sat there, fork trembling in my hand, pasta halfway to my mouth, trying to process what I was hearing. Every word was a knife twisting, each syllable cutting into the years I had spent caring, supporting, loving. The man I had trusted, the man I had imagined sharing a life with, was publicly humiliating me. Not privately, not in a moment of conflict, but in front of his entire family. I could hear his sister Melissa chuckling lightly, like this was entertainment. His mother tried to intervene, but Garrett wasn't finished. "Oh, I'll change her," he said smugly. "Once we're married and I control the finances, Mommy Dearest gets cut off. She'll see her on holidays like normal people." My hands tightened into fists beneath the table. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I felt every pang of betrayal, every ounce of disbelief, every flicker of rage and sorrow colliding in one explosive surge. The world I had built in my mind, the one where we loved and supported each other, crumbled in seconds. I placed the napkin carefully on the table, my movements deliberate, controlled, though my body shook. My voice was calm, quiet, but cutting through the stunned silence like glass. "You're right," I said. "Little girls shouldn't get married." Then I stood. Every eye followed me as I rose, a quiet defiance in my posture. I didn't wait for apologies or explanations. I didn't look back. I left the table, walked out of the room, and out of the life I had thought was mine. My phone buzzed with immediate messages, pleas, threats, excuses, but I didn't respond. I didn't even want to. I drove to my mother's house, hands tight on the wheel, heart hammering, each breath a mixture of relief and pain. When I arrived, she looked at me with a calm curiosity. She made tea, waited, and as I told her everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the words that had cut me down in front of everyone, I felt a quiet, terrifying clarity. I didn't just need to escape the dinner. I needed to escape the man who had shown his true self that night. I sat on the worn couch in my mother's living room, the familiar scent of chamomile tea and old books wrapping around me like a protective blanket. The teacup warmed my hands, but it did little to quell the storm raging inside. My chest ached, not from hunger, not from fatigue, but from betrayal, humiliation, and disbelief. I couldn't stop replaying the words Garrett had said, each one slicing deeper every time I thought about it. "You're just a little girl who needs her mommy." The sentence repeated itself, a cruel echo in my mind. I had spent my entire life learning to stand strong, to take care of others, to love without expectation. And in one breath, Garrett had reduced all of that to childish dependence, something laughable, something shameful. The more I thought about it, the more I felt both fury and sorrow, rage at his audacity, sorrow for the love I had poured into someone who could so callously betray me. I tried to text him, fingers hovering over the screen, but my hands shook too much. I wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, to scream until someone heard me. But I knew there would be no answer that could make sense. The man I had loved had revealed himself in a moment of public cruelty, and words couldn't undo that. My mother finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I never liked her," she said after a long pause. Her words weren't judgmental, not really. They were observational, almost matter of fact. "But I saw you happy, so I stayed quiet." I looked at her, stunned. "Why?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. "She never once offered to help when she came over," Mom explained. "Never brought anything to Sunday lunch. Never said thank you. And she rolled her eyes when you hugged me goodbye. Small things, but they add up." Her words made something click inside me. I realized that the humiliation I felt wasn't just about Garrett's words. It was about the pattern I had ignored, the subtle ways he had disrespected me, belittled me, and dismissed my life outside of him. And now the mask had slipped completely. I understood, with painful clarity, that this wasn't a mistake, an isolated incident, or a bad joke. It was who he really was. I spent that night in my old bedroom, the walls familiar, the air heavy with memory. I let myself cry quietly, not from weakness, but from the release of holding in years of love, hope, and expectation that had been violently ripped away. Every sob was a mixture of anger, loss, and the strange relief of finally seeing the truth. By morning, a sharp clarity had taken root. I could no longer pretend that our relationship was built on love, mutual respect, or partnership. Garrett's words, the way he had humiliated me in front of his family, the way he had dismissed my care for my mother, it wasn't something I could overlook, excuse, or forgive easily. I realized something else too. I was not powerless. The betrayal had been public, the humiliation complete, but I could reclaim my agency. I didn't need to beg for apologies or allow him back into my life under the guise of love. I could take control of my own life, my own finances, my own choices. The storm inside me, once paralyzing, began to turn into quiet, resolute determination. And so, as I sipped the last of my tea and watched the morning light filter through the curtains, I made a decision. I would not let Garrett dictate the terms of my life, my dignity, or my love for my mother. I would take the steps to leave him, to protect myself, and to reclaim the life I had built outside of his cruel judgment. The first step, I knew, would be practical, packing up my life from the apartment we shared, separating myself from the space where humiliation had occurred. But the more important step, the deeper one, was emotional, reclaiming my worth, my pride, and my autonomy. For the first time in hours, I breathed fully, deeply. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. I had survived the night of public humiliation. I had felt the full force of betrayal, and I was ready to face what came next, not as a victim, but as a woman determined to never let anyone undermine her again. The days following the anniversary dinner were a blur of tension, dread, and calculated steps. Garrett's initial smugness transformed quickly into panic as he realized I was serious. I didn't answer his calls. I didn't reply to his texts. Each notification buzzing on my phone became a small victory, a reminder that I still had agency, even as my chest tightened every time I saw his name flash across the screen. It didn't take long for the escalation to begin. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, which gave me the quiet space to start the extraction of my life from our shared apartment. My hands shook as I packed my clothes, my books, my work equipment, the gaming setup that had been my escape on long nights. I left behind the furniture, the pieces I had bought with him, as a gesture of finality, but I took the one thing that mattered most to me, a 65-inch OLED TV I had saved for months to buy. If I was reclaiming my life, it would be on my terms. The moment Garrett discovered I had moved my things, the storm began. Calls, texts, messages, from pleading to angry, from manipulative to threatening, flooded my phone. "Where are you? This is ridiculous. You can't just leave. We need to talk." One after another, his words pounded through the quiet of my mother's living room. I read them, then put the phone down. He had no claim over my choices, my movements, or my life. Then came his friends and family, the secondary waves of chaos. His sister Melissa texted, incredulous and judgmental. His mother, Patricia, called repeatedly, trying to mediate, to convince me that I was destroying Garrett, that I was overreacting. I listened quietly, letting their words wash over me, recognizing that none of them could truly understand what had happened. None of them had witnessed the casual cruelty, the public humiliation, the repeated belittling, the calculated undermining of my love for my mother. By midweek, the real escalation hit when Garrett realized that the practical consequences of my leaving were unavoidable. Our apartment, my name on the utilities, the remaining rent, the accounts, it was all my responsibility no longer, and I wasn't about to let him manipulate me into staying. The panic in his voice during a call one afternoon was palpable. "You can't just abandon me," he said, anger and fear mixing. "You're being financially abusive." I let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. Financially abusive? I had spent 2 years paying the majority of our expenses, supporting him, covering everything from groceries to weekend trips. The absurdity of his accusation only strengthened my resolve. "No," I said calmly, my voice firm. "I'm just finally taking care of myself." As the week wore on, his desperation grew, and so did the involvement of his family. His father, Frank, called, a contractor I had always respected. I answered cautiously, unsure of whether he would side with me or Garrett. To my surprise, Frank was measured, thoughtful, but also clear. "Son," he said to Garrett over speakerphone, "I'm not calling to defend what you said. That was out of line. But walking out on a 3-year relationship over one comment seems extreme." I intervened quietly, explaining the context, the public humiliation, the repeated threats to control my life, the casual cruelty. Frank listened, long pauses marking his contemplation, and then he sighed. "I can't say I blame her. Take care of yourself, son," he said to Garrett. By this point, the escalation wasn't just emotional, it had become logistical. Garrett's panic over the apartment, over finances, over the unraveling control he thought he had, collided with my steady, deliberate reclamation of my life. Each text, each call, each visit from friends or family became a battlefield where my calm determination met his desperation and anger. Meanwhile, I felt the emotional weight of the escalation acutely. I would sit with my mother, drinking tea in the quiet afternoons, processing every message, every call, every interaction. The betrayal, humiliation, and anger coexisted with relief, clarity, and a sense of empowerment I had not realized I could feel. I was living in a paradox, grieving a relationship I had invested in for years, while simultaneously reclaiming my power, my dignity, and my life. The final layer of tension came from the ripple effects among our mutual friends. Some tried to mediate, others gossiped, others took sides. I watched as the people who had once surrounded Garrett with admiration and camaraderie began to see the cracks, the pattern of cruelty, the person he revealed himself to be. And through it all, I remained steady, calculating, determined to protect myself from further damage while allowing him to face the consequences of his actions. By the end of the week, the storm had reached its peak. Calls, texts, social media posts, family interventions, all of it collided into a chaotic crescendo. Yet through it, I felt an unexpected clarity, the power of control I had been denied for years, the ability to choose my life, to set boundaries, to assert my worth, was now firmly in my hands. The escalation, though painful and chaotic, had illuminated my strength, and for the first time in months, I felt untouchable in my resolve. By the time Friday night arrived, exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy fog. My body ached from moving boxes. My mind ached from the constant barrage of messages, calls, and guilt-laden words from Garrett, his family, and even friends who thought they knew better. I had survived the public humiliation, reclaimed my belongings, and stood firm against every attempt to manipulate me, but in the quiet of my mother's dimly lit living room, the weight of it all hit me like a tidal wave. I sank into the couch, the soft cushions barely supporting my trembling frame. My hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, and I let my head fall back. For the first time in days, I allowed the tears to come, not in anger, not in defiance, but in pure, unfiltered grief. Grief for the betrayal, grief for the dreams that had been shattered in front of dozens of witnesses, grief for the love I had offered freely and unconditionally that had been repaid with cruelty. The room felt impossibly small, the shadows of the evening stretching long and cold across the walls. Each ping of my phone sent a jolt of anxiety through me, a reminder that the chaos had not yet ended. Garrett's texts had shifted from anger to desperation, pleas, accusations, manipulations, veiled threats. The words blurred together, a cacophony of guilt and entitlement that no longer held any sway over my actions, but that still cut into my heart. I thought about the anniversary dinner, the way his laughter had rung in my ears like a death knell, the way he had mocked me, diminished me, and turned my love for my mother into a weapon against me. I saw the faces of the family members around that table, the shock, the silence, the tension, and I felt the humiliation anew. The image of Garrett smirking as he publicly labeled me a little girl replayed over and over, a relentless, tormenting loop. For the first time, I allowed myself to confront a terrifying truth. I had underestimated the depth of my emotional investment and the devastation of its betrayal. I had believed that love and loyalty would shield me, that kindness and patience would be reciprocated, but in the stark light of reality, I realized that I had been exposed, vulnerable, and entirely unprepared for the magnitude of his cruelty. My mother sat nearby, silent at first, sensing the storm without words. She let me cry, let the tears fall freely, offering only the quiet presence of someone who understood that some wounds needed space to bleed. I thought about the life I had built, the plans for marriage, the shared dreams of stability and companionship, and I felt a crushing void. The future I had envisioned had evaporated, leaving only the harsh, cold landscape of betrayal and loss. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape, for comfort, for reassurance, but there was none to be had. I was alone in the wreckage of what I had believed was a partnership built on love, and the isolation was suffocating. The sense of failure, not in myself, but in misjudging him, gnawed at my core. Questions flooded my mind. Had I been blind? Foolish? Could I have seen the signs sooner? Every memory now seemed tinged with doubt, every smile from him now shadowed by the weight of deceit. And yet, amidst the despair, a quiet ember of resolve remained. Even as my body shook with grief and my mind spun with the magnitude of the betrayal, I knew I could not stay in this place forever. The darkness was complete, yes, but within it, a faint awareness stirred. I had survived public humiliation, emotional manipulation, and the shattering of a relationship I had believed unbreakable. If I could endure this, I could endure anything. I stayed on that couch for hours, letting the tears run, letting the pain wash over me fully, acknowledging every ounce of hurt, betrayal, and sorrow. It was the deepest, most suffocating darkness I had ever faced. But in that darkness, a seed of clarity began to grow. I was not powerless. I was not defeated. And though I could not yet see the path forward clearly, I knew it existed, just beyond the horizon of this despair. By the time the night deepened, exhaustion had claimed me, but the ember of determination refused to die. It whispered that the next step was not revenge, not pleading, not reconciliation, but reclamation. Reclamation of my dignity, my agency, and my life. The dark moment had broken me in one sense, yes, but it had also forged the beginning of a strength I had not known I possessed. Morning light crept through the blinds, soft and tentative, a quiet reminder that the world moved on even when mine had felt like it had stopped. I sat at the small kitchen table in my mother's house, coffee steaming in front of me, the scent grounding me. The night's despair had ebbed, leaving clarity in its wake. I had survived the dark moment, and now it was time to reclaim control. The first step was confronting the practical consequences of leaving Garrett. I organized my paperwork, utility bills, and bank statements. Every document I touched was a tangible assertion of my autonomy. He had assumed that leaving him would be an emotional surrender, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. Every calculation, every signature, every carefully written note reinforced that I was no longer under his influence. Then came the revelations. As I sorted through our shared accounts, I realized just how much control he had believed he wielded. Garrett had assumed that by dominating finances, he could manipulate and contain me. But in reality, I had maintained oversight, paid for what I needed, and preserved a silent autonomy. The irony was sharp, almost delicious. He had attempted to assert dominance over someone who had quietly safeguarded her independence all along. The day progressed, and the messages came. Garrett's tone shifted again, from anger to pleading, from accusations to justification. But I had learned the pattern. I had watched it unfold over the week, and this time I responded not with emotion, but with firm detachment. I am not returning. The apartment is in your name. I have left everything else. Short, precise, a scalpel of clarity that left no room for argument. I also reached out to mutual contacts cautiously, confirming that I had acted responsibly and transparently. The narrative he had tried to spin, that I had abandoned him, sabotaged his life, or taken unfair advantage, collapsed under the weight of truth. Friends, family, and even his father Frank came to understand the reality. The humiliation, the manipulation, and the cruelty were his, not mine. By mid-afternoon, the tangible reclamation of power merged with an emotional resurgence. I realized I was no longer the little girl he had described at the dinner table. I was a woman who had endured public humiliation, whose choices had been challenged, whose loyalty had been belittled, and yet I had risen, deliberate and composed, unbroken. Garrett finally called, desperation raw in his voice. "Please, can we talk? Can we—" I cut him off. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, calm but immovable. "You have shown who you are. I am reclaiming my life. You cannot dictate who I am, what I do, or how I care for my mother." There was silence on the line, a long pause that carried both disbelief and recognition. I could almost hear him understanding at last that his public cruelty and manipulative attempts had failed. He had assumed power, and I had quietly, decisively stripped it from him, not in vengeance, not in spite, but in the simple act of claiming my life back. The final affirmation came when I began planning for my own future outside of Garrett. I arranged a small celebration for my mother's birthday, using funds I had preserved, paying for everything myself, inviting only those who genuinely cared. The satisfaction was quiet but profound. The money he had assumed he controlled went instead to nurturing life, joy, and family bonds, not to his ego or manipulation. By the evening, I felt an internal shift, a release of the tension that had held me captive for months. The turning point was not a dramatic confrontation or a spectacle. It was the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming my agency, asserting boundaries, and refusing to allow humiliation or manipulation to define me. I was no longer a little girl in his eyes, no longer a pawn in his display of control. I was myself, capable, autonomous, and unassailable. And as I sat in the gentle evening light, watching my mother smile, helping her place flowers on the table, I understood something fundamental. True power was not in domination or public spectacle. It was in the calm reclamation of one's life, one's dignity, and one's choices. I had been humiliated, yes, but I had risen, stronger and wiser, and I would not allow anyone to strip me of that strength again. The days after the turning point felt strangely surreal, like the world was both moving and standing still at the same time. Garrett's attempts to regain control had all but evaporated. His calls became sporadic, texts shifted from desperate pleas to thinly veiled accusations, and the veneer of his composure cracked in ways I had long anticipated. Yet the fallout wasn't immediate for me. It was cascading around him, a tidal wave he couldn't contain. His family, who had initially tried to mediate, now faced the consequences of having underestimated me. Frank, his father, began to realize just how far Garrett had misrepresented our relationship, and how much damage had been inflicted by the illusion of dominance he tried to maintain. "Son," Frank said over a call, voice measured but tinged with disappointment, "you've built a lot of bridges to nowhere. It's on you now to fix them, not on her." Even Garrett's sister, Melissa, who had laughed during the initial dinner at the jokes and jabs, began to see the unraveling of the carefully curated narrative he had spun. Texts from her became muted, awkward, apologetic even, though never directly to me. Their silence, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks, mirrored the social fallout he could no longer ignore. Then there was the social ripple. Friends and acquaintances who had relied on his charm and manipulation began questioning their loyalty. Invitations dwindled, support waned, and his previous aura of invincibility eroded under the weight of his own actions. His attempts to paint me as unreasonable or controlling fell flat when mutual friends recounted what they had witnessed: the public humiliation, the relentless control, the casual cruelty. Slowly, the social circle he had assumed would rally behind him began to collapse. Meanwhile, I settled into the quiet aftermath with a sense of liberated purpose. I had moved into my own space, a small but comfortable apartment that felt like an extension of myself rather than a shared battleground. I began to rebuild routines that had been disrupted: Sunday lunches with my mother, morning coffee rituals, small acts of self-care I had neglected while entwined in the storm with Garrett. The practical aspects of my life, finances, space, autonomy, were no longer points of contention. They were proof of survival, tangible affirmations that I had reclaimed what was mine. Social media, which had once amplified Garrett's attempts at manipulation, now served as a stage for the consequences he faced. Posts went unanswered, stories ignored, and the entitlement that had characterized his previous behavior was met with silence or subtle backlash. Attempts to control the narrative failed because the truth, the humiliations he had caused, the manipulations he had attempted, the cruelty he had displayed, was now visible, undeniable, and verified by witnesses. In the private moments, the fallout was more intimate but equally profound. I reflected on the relationships that had been tested and the boundaries I had reinforced. My mother's presence, unwavering and quietly proud, reminded me that loyalty, love, and respect were reciprocated. I had not lost what mattered most. Instead, I had preserved it while removing toxicity from my life. Garrett, on the other hand, faced the personal cost of his behavior. The wedding plans dissolved completely. The deposits I had withdrawn were redirected or refunded, and the illusion of control he had held over me had crumbled entirely. Friends stopped calling, family confronted him with the truth, and the social networks he relied upon to maintain influence began to disengage. Each consequence, though not instantaneous, reinforced the reality that cruelty, manipulation, and public humiliation leave lasting marks, sometimes on the perpetrator more than the victim. I found a sense of quiet satisfaction, not in revenge, but in the restoration of balance. Where there had been chaos, there was now order. Where there had been humiliation, there was dignity. Where there had been manipulation, there was clarity. The fallout, though painful to witness in others, was also a testament to the strength and resilience I had cultivated in the process. By the end of the second week, the ripple effects had fully manifested. Garrett's social standing, credibility, and personal relationships bore the scars of his actions. My own life, however, had stabilized. I had a safe space, supportive relationships, financial independence, and most importantly, a restored sense of self. The consequences that befell him were not the point. The point was that I had emerged intact, stronger, and wiser, fully capable of moving forward without the shadow of humiliation or control. And in that stillness, I understood the profound truth. Sometimes the fallout does not come immediately, and sometimes it is messy and social, but it always finds its mark. Justice in this case was less about punishment and more about natural consequence, the inevitable result of a character revealed in full. Sitting in the quiet of my own apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, I felt a sense of peace that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, strength, and an unshakable understanding of my own worth. The humiliation, the betrayal, and the chaos were memories now, sharp, but no longer wielding power over me. I thought about the lessons carved into every painful moment. Love is not surrendering your boundaries, nor is loyalty a reason to tolerate cruelty. Respect is earned, not assumed. And perhaps most importantly, the people who claim to care about you will never demean or manipulate you for their own ego. Those who do reveal their true selves quickly, and life has a way of showing you that sooner rather than later. My mother smiled across the table as I poured her a cup of tea, the simplicity of the gesture grounding me. "You're strong," she said softly, and I knew she meant more than just surviving. Strength was in setting limits, reclaiming control, and refusing to let someone else define my value. Even Garrett's collapse, socially, personally, financially, was a silent confirmation of the truth. Accountability follows actions, whether immediately or in the ripples that unfold later. I didn't need to gloat or watch him stumble. I only needed to focus on building the life I wanted. Matthew, my new partner, arrived later that evening, calm and steady, an embodiment of what respect and shared values could look like. Our relationship unfolded gently, a stark contrast to the storm I had endured. Here was companionship without control, love without humiliation, support without manipulation. It was simple, yet profound. As I settled into the rhythm of my restored life, I realized that the anniversary dinner, the cruel, public, humiliating moment that had felt like an end, was actually a beginning. It revealed truths, clarified boundaries, and forced me to act decisively. In losing what was toxic, I had gained clarity, autonomy, and an unbreakable sense of self. The final lesson was unmistakable. Loving oneself and protecting one's dignity is not selfish. It is essential. Any partner, family, or friend who cannot respect that is unworthy of your time or heart. And sometimes the most empowering moments come not from victory over others, but from reclaiming your own life on your own terms with courage and integrity. I leaned back, breathed deeply, and smiled. Life had moved on, and so had I. Stronger, wiser, and unafraid, I was ready for whatever came next, because loving and respecting myself was the foundation no one could take away.